And then there's an intersubjective sense too, because it's also about your culture and what your cultural experience has been and what's the new hot topic then. So it starts to make sense, like it's how beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there's also an objective sense to it too, and it changes over time as well. Hey Sapiens, we're back, and we just spoke about cause and effect, which we will get back to, but we've been talking a lot about the objective level of reality. At least that's what I've been trying to describe, seeing some of the problems with trying to approach objective reality. And now we can talk about subjective reality, which this is going to be more about like the intrinsic internal rewards, but I actually heard about this from a guest on Lex Fridman's podcast, and Lex Fridman, Lord bless him, but he often asks about the meaning of life from his guests, like unironically, very emphatically, he asks, what do you think the meaning of life is? And one of his guests actually spoke about this article, which is the drive of intelligent agents and subjective meaning. So far, much of this explanation is objective, and for many of us, this will not be as helpful to our personal woes or provide direction. We expect the meaning of life to tell us what we should be doing. And first, we'll attempt to explain why we are currently doing what we're doing. But I found this work that was recommended here by Jürgen Schmidhuber to be incredible. It's called, his paper, Driven by Compression Progress, a simple principle explains essential aspects of subjective beauty, novelty, surprise, interestingness, attention, curiosity, creativity, art, science, music, jokes. So Schmidhuber gives an algorithmic framework of the drive of all intelligent creatures. So to quote the abstract here, I argue that data becomes temporarily interesting by itself to some self-improving but computationally limited subjective observer once he learns to predict or compress the data in a better way, thus making it subjectively simpler and more beautiful. Curiosity is the desire to create or discover more non-random, non-arbitrary, regular data that is novel and surprising, not in the traditional sense of Boltzmann and Shannon, but in the sense that it allows for compression progress because its regularity was not yet known. This drive maximizes interestingness, the first derivative of subjective beauty or compressibility, that is, the steepness of the learning curve. It motivates exploring infants, pure mathematicians, composers, artists, dancers, comedians, yourself, and since 1990, artificial systems. All right, so you gotta love how Schmidhuber talks. He's an interesting guy, maybe a bit grandiose, but there's a lot he's saying here and a lot to be said about it. And I think what's weird is once you really learn about this idea, so many things do become explainable within the framework. So let's try to dig into this here. I think this is pretty significant. Let's start with a simple example of compression, because this is a lot about compression drive. So for example, if you receive a data package which contains A, B, 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 so 5 A's, 4 B's, you could just compress that into 5A, 4B, which has the same meaning but takes up less space. So this type of compression is called run length encoding because you define how long the run of a character is. And in the above example, there are two runs, a run of 5 A's and another 4 B's. And that's from the data compression Wikipedia article. So that's the basic idea of compression, right? It's just you're getting the same information in a smaller amount of space. And there are a ton of compression algorithms out there. But in the human case, Our data stream is not a sequence of letters, but the whole of our experience, our thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Our encoding, decoding, and compression scheme is still not fully known. However, the algorithmic framework is given in section 1.2 as follows. And I just remove the citations here, but Schmidhuber defines 4 steps to this in this algorithmic process. So number 1, you store everything. And number 2 is you improve subjective compressibility. And 3 is you let intrinsic curiosity reward reflect compression progress. And number 4 is you maximize intrinsic curiosity reward. So let's go through it. So step 1, store everything. During interaction with the world, store the entire raw history of actions and sensory observations, including reward signals. The data is holy as it is the only basis of all that can be known about the world. To see that full data storage is not unrealistic. A human lifetime rarely lasts much longer than 3 times 10 to the 9th power seconds. The human brain has roughly 10 to the 10th power neurons. So each with 10 to the 4th power synapses on average. So assuming that only half of the brain's capacity is used for storing raw data, and that each synapse can store at most 6 bits, there is still enough capacity to encode the lifelong sensory input stream with a rate of roughly 10 to the 5th bits per second, comparable to the demands of a movie with reasonable resolution. So the storage capacity of affordable technical systems will soon exceed this value, so we can put this in machines. And if you can store the data, don't throw it away. So again, that was step 1, store everything. Step 2 is you improve subjective compressibility. So in principle, any regularity in the data history can be used to compress it. The compressed version of the data can be viewed as its simplifying explanation. Thus, to better explain the world, spend some of the computation time on an adaptive compression algorithm trying to partially compress the data. For example, an adaptive neural network may be able to learn to predict or post-dict some of the historic data from other historic data, thus incrementally reducing the number of bits required to encode the whole. So step 3 was let intrinsic curiosity reward reflect compression progress. The agent should monitor the improvements of the adaptive data compressor. Whenever it learns to reduce the number of bits required to encode the historic data, generate an intrinsic reward signal or curiosity reward signal in proportion to the learning progress or compression progress, that is, the number of saved bits. Basically, the better able you are to compress your past experience, the more of a reward you get, either through curiosity or just an intrinsic, oh, it feels good. And step 4 is you maximize intrinsic curiosity reward. So let the action selector or controller use a general reinforcement learning algorithm, which should be able to observe the current state of the adaptive compressor to maximize expected reward, including intrinsic curiosity reward. To optimize the latter, a good reinforcement learning algorithm will select actions that focus the agent's attention and learning capabilities on those aspects of the world that allow for finding or creating new, previously unknown but learnable regularities. In other words, it will try to maximize the steepness of the compressor's learning curve. This type of active, unsupervised learning can help it figure out how the world works. So this kind of, I think, makes some intuitive sense, right? It's like, where does curiosity come from? Why do we have curiosity? And it's also, how does an intelligent agent choose what to do? And it's really about following your curiosity. And again, how do we evaluate curiosity from internally, subjectively? Well, your curiosity is what your body, the schema in it, thinks will compress your history the most, the history of your information, your experience. So We'll give a ton of examples of this, but section 1.3 of the paper discusses the relation to external reward. The description given applies to internal rewards, curiosity, satisfaction. But of course, the real goal of many cognitive systems is not just to satisfy their curiosity, but to solve externally given problems. Any formalizable problem can be rephrased as a reinforcement learning problem for an agent living in a possibly unknown environment, trying to maximize the future external reward expected until the end of its possibly finite lifetime. So, it's using its internal reward, but it's also trying to solve external problems and external rewards. An external reward might be like, taking a warm bath. That's nice, that's comforting, but anything external. And we use our ability to compress to try to solve problems in the external world. But in many contexts, we live in a rare reward environment. So one way of focusing and directing our actions is through our internal rewards of compression until an external rare reward is reached. Like, this can be why playing a chess game for a machine is kind of difficult, because technically it's when you win a game that you get the most reward. And the end of the game is, of course, at the very end. So the reward is very sparse. We have to make a lot of decisions in terms of how we move pieces until we finally get to the end of the game. But another way of looking at that, though, is to then, if the external world is so sparse in reward, we can be driven by our internal rewards. So again, that's like curiosity and satisfaction and these types of things. And Section 2 of the paper discusses the consequences of the compression progress drive, which Smidhuba argues intelligence and cognition are byproducts of. So quoting this paper, 2.1 of the paper, compact internal representations or symbols as byproducts of efficient history compression. To compress the history of observation so far, the compressor, say a predictive neural network, will automatically create internal representations or symbols. For example, patterns across certain neural feature detectors for things that frequently repeat themselves. Even when there is limited predictability, efficient compression can still be achieved by assigning short codes to events that are predictable with high probability. For example, the sun goes up every day. Hence, it is efficient to create internal symbols such as daylight to describe this repetitive aspect of the data history by a short reusable piece of internal code, instead of storing just the raw data. In fact, predictive neural networks are often observed to create such internal and hierarchical codes as a byproduct of minimizing their prediction error on the training data. So this kind of makes sense, right? Like, almost every language will likely have words for the sun and the moon. When you see something regularly and it's a common event, then we often develop a word to describe it and talk about it. So it's another interesting thing is that, like, okay, if I asked you, what did you do yesterday? And you probably won't give me a full 16-hour long breakdown of everything that happened, right? It really depends on how typical your day was. And it's also about who you're talking with. Do you know that they have a similar experience? The more experience the person you're communicating with has that is shared between you, the easier it is to compress information and just say oh yeah, I went to work and then got home and watched TV. If it's something like that, most of the time people will be like, oh, okay. But if you had a really unusual day, it's very difficult to compress that in a very simple way because it's very unusual. And maybe it was really fun. But again, it's just interesting that the more usual something is, the easier it is to compress. And in a way, you almost forget about it. But 2.2, this is getting very interesting. Consciousness as a particular byproduct of compression. So there is one thing that is involved in all actions and sensory inputs of the agent, namely the agent itself. To efficiently encode the entire data history, it will profit from creating some sort of internal symbol or code, e.g. a neural activity pattern, representing the agent itself. Whenever this representation is actively used, say by activating the corresponding neurons through new incoming sensory inputs or otherwise, the agent could be called self-aware or conscious. This straightforward explanation apparently does not abandon any essential aspects of our intuitive concept of consciousness, yet seems substantially simpler than other recent views. In the rest of this paper, we will not have to attach any particular mystic value to the notion of consciousness. In our view, it is just a natural byproduct of the agent's ongoing process of problem solving and world modeling through data compression, and will not play a prominent role in the remainder of this paper. So it's a really quick aside. It's like, okay, here's consciousness. But basically, when we say the word I or whatever, we have a name for ourselves. It's any intelligent creature which models itself, which has some self-reflection. That's going to help it encode information. And it'll help it to compress. And I mean, I guess I'm not super endorsing this, but it is an interesting way to think about consciousness and maybe to pick it out in an explanatory way. But it's just that you're going to model yourself at some point as an intelligent creature. But 2.3 of this paper, section 2.3, the lazy brain's subjective, time-dependent sense of beauty. Schmidhuber argues our subjective sense of beauty is directly proportional to the number of bits required to encode an experience. So think of human faces. One way to efficiently encode human faces is to build a prototype face. So new faces are compared to the prototype, just this very generic sense of a face, which has proportions as an average of every face seen. The more a face is like the prototype, the less information is needed to encode the face. Thus, the face feels beautiful to the observer. So, quote here, in principle, the compressor may exploit any regularity for reducing the number of bits required to store the data. A face which is asymmetrical on each side from the center will be very beautiful if the encoding of the face can be compressed to nearly half the size, since the face can mostly be mirrored with one half of the face. So yeah, again, right, if you're really symmetrical and straight down the middle, then it's easy to just encode half the face, and then you just have to flip it over. So generally speaking, among several subpatterns classified as comparable by a given observer, the subjectively most beautiful is the one with the simplest or shortest description, given the observer's current particular method for encoding and memorizing it. For example, mathematicians find beauty in a simple proof with a short description in the formal language they are using. Others like geometrically simple, aesthetically pleasing, low complexity drawings of various objects. This immediately explains why many human observers prefer faces similar to their own. What they see every day in the mirror will influence their subjective prototype face for simple reasons of coding efficiency. So this is another interesting way to talk about beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and beauty is also subjective, but it's also about how many faces you've seen and how commonly you see faces. When you see certain faces, either of a race or age or whatever, over your experience, that influences your prototype and how you compress faces, which influences how you store that and how you experience it. And yeah, unfortunately, if someone has a very unusual face or if they're asymmetrical, then it takes more brain power to encode their face in memory. There's more information there, and people end up finding it to be a struggle, and they find that person less aesthetically pleasing. But talking about section 2.4, subjective interestingness as first derivative of subjective beauty. So the steepness of the learning curve. So a quote here, what's beautiful is not necessarily interesting. A beautiful thing is interesting only as long as it is new. That is, as long as the algorithmic regularity that makes it simple has not yet been fully assimilated by the adaptive observer, who is still learning to compress the data better. The first derivative of subjective beauty, as the learning agent improves its compression algorithm, formerly apparently random data parts become subjectively more regular and beautiful, requiring fewer and fewer bits for their encoding. As long as this process is not over, the data remains interesting and rewarding. So a quick note too on the first derivative. Think of a first derivative as finding the slope of a line at a single point. The slope tells us the rate of change. In this case, interestingness is the rate of expected compression. So that's all. It's just like, how fast are you able to compress something? How quickly can you come to a short description? So again, it's like, when we talk about art, which we'll get into very soon here, but things are beautiful, but the more you stare at something and it seems like it gets a little less subjectively beautiful to you, it doesn't hit you as hard, but that's also because your brain is continually adapting to compress further and further, and it becomes less interesting the better you get at it. And so that's kind of one way though, when something might look like, oh yeah, I recognize that, and is less beautiful to you, in that sense you've like fully memorized the picture or the person, and in a way that's changed your prototype. So now you'll encode future things in a different way based on the faces that you've seen. So part of what I think is so beautiful here, or what's so incredible too, is it starts to explain a lot. Like, yeah, there are objective, intersubjective, and subjective levels of beauty. There's objectivity in beauty in terms of symmetry and how easy something is to encode. However, beauty is also subjective because it's about the individual person and their individual compressor, all their history and everything that they've seen and what their basic prototypes are. And then there's an intersubjective sense too, because it's also about your culture and what your cultural experience has been and what's the new hot topic then. So it starts to make sense, like it's how beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there's also an objective sense to it too, and it changes over time as well. Just seems like philosophers who talk about beauty, which I haven't delved in deeply to, they could really use this kind of information. But section 2.6 is also about true novelty and surprise versus traditional information theory. So imagine that there's two visual observers where one is kept completely in the dark and one is exposed to a screen of random white noise. The darkness is extremely compressible as it's always the same. The noise is highly unpredictable and fundamentally incompressible data. In both cases, the data is boring as it does not allow for further compression progress. So that's interesting, right? Two extremes, total darkness, totally random. And on both sides, there's nothing you can really do to compress it much. And it just becomes really boring and really uninteresting really fast. So a lot of the interestingness is regularities in between those two. Not so random, not so bland. But section 2.7 is about attention, curiosity, and active experimentation. So, quote here, in the absence of external reward, or when there is no known way to further increase the expected external reward, our controller essentially tries to maximize true novelty or interestingness, the first derivative of subjective beauty or compressibility, the steepness of the learning curve. It will do its best to select action sequences expected to create observations yielding maximal expected future compression progress, given the limitations of both the compressor and the compressor improvement algorithm. It will learn to focus its attention and its actively chosen experiments on things that are currently still incompressible, but are expected to be compressible or predictable through additional learning. It will get bored by things that are already subjectively compressible. It will also get bored by things that are currently incompressible, but will apparently remain so, given the experience so far, or where the costs of making them compressible exceed those of making other things compressible, etc. So, wow, there's a lot there. Okay, so here we see the drive to action observed of exploring human infants and other intelligent agents. So why do scientists work on smaller, specific problems instead of bigger, universal problems? An explanation is given above. The scientists expect the problem will not be compressible in the near future, so they lose attention and curiosity in that problem. So that's fascinating, right? It's like, why don't scientists do experiments that have all been repeated and well known? Well, it's not that interesting because it's been done. It's very compressible. People don't often want to see like the same thing over and over again. Why? Because that's compressible and it's not interesting. And so, again, these grand, huge projects that will have too much of a cost and not enough payoff, those are also not as exciting. And again, I'm like, whoa, mind blower, but the meaning of life. Why is it that the case that most people don't care about the meaning of life? They find that the cost is too great, the answer is too far, and while it would be cool, it doesn't seem like it's within reach if you really think about the meaning of life. And so that makes it really uninteresting to a lot of people. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's why I'm a bit of a weirdo. Like, I don't have that same stopping point. I don't have the same analysis as other people that the meaning of life is so unattainable and not worth going for. But also, you know, some things might be too simple, and then it's really about finding what's on the edge of our knowledge, the edge of our ability to compress. And so it's like the stuff that's like right there. But section 2.8 goes over these discoveries. So an unusually large compression breakthrough deserves the name discovery. For example, as mentioned in the introduction, the simple law of gravity can be described by a very short piece of code, yet it allows for greatly compressing all previous observations of falling apples and other objects. So again, we're seeing here, when we discover something like the equation for gravity, it explains so much in so little. It's highly compressing, and that's part of why we find it so fascinating. So section 2.9, beyond standard unsupervised learning. Where there is predictability, compression can be achieved by assigning short codes to those parts of the observations that are predictable from previous observations with high probability. Generally speaking, we may say that a major goal of traditional unsupervised learning is to improve the compression of the observed data by discovering a program that computes and thus explains the history, and hopefully does so quickly, but is clearly shorter than the shortest previously known program of this kind. Traditional unsupervised learning is not enough though. It just analyzes and encodes the data, but does not choose it. We have to extend it along the dimension of active action selection, since our unsupervised learning must also choose the actions that influence the observed data. Just like a scientist chooses his experiments, a baby its toys, an artist his colors, a dancer his moves, or any attentive system its next sensory input. That's precisely what is achieved by a reinforcement learning-based framework for curiosity and creativity. So boom, that's so interesting. It's not just about encoding, but it's also about what choice do we make, that we intervene on the sensory input, that we change the world such that we're testing hypotheses. So we rule things out and we find better compression. This is another way that we can actually choose which actions we take. So this is, again, that compression drive. Section 2.10 is art and music as byproducts of the compression progress drive. So quote here, good observer-dependent art deepens the observer's insights about this world or possible worlds, unveiling previously unknown regularities in compressible data, connecting previously disconnected patterns in an initially surprising way that makes the combination of these patterns subjectively more compressible. So art as an eye-opener, and eventually becomes known and less interesting. I postulate that the active creation and attentive perception of all kinds of artwork are just byproducts of our principle of interestingness and curiosity, yielding reward for compressor improvements. So, artificial or human observers must perceive art sequentially and typically also actively, e.g., through a sequence of attention-shifting eye saccades or camera movements, scanning a sculpture, or internal shifts of attention that filter and emphasize sounds made by a pianist, while suppressing background noise. Undoubtedly, many derive pleasure and rewards from perceiving works of art, such as certain paintings or songs. But different subjective observers with different sensory apparati and compressor improvement algorithms will prefer different input sequences. Hence, any objective theory of what is good art must take the subjective observer as a parameter to answer questions such as, which sequences of actions and resulting shifts of attention should they execute to maximize their pleasure. According to our principle, they should select one that maximizes the quickly learnable compressibility that is new relative to their current knowledge and their usually limited way of incorporating, learning, and compressing new data. Okay, so wow. So there's a lot here, but again, this is why things are both objective and subjective, and it's all about knowing your audience. And think about, like, again, it's just a bit of a mind blower, but music. Music, when you first listen to a great song and it just fills you with a sense of beauty and just all kinds of positive emotions, and you're like, wow, I really like this song. And then maybe you listen to it on repeat for 2 weeks and you listen to it a lot. Well, what are you doing there? You like listen to the chorus and you're like, dang, that's great. And then after 2 weeks, like, you play a song out, and why it slowly gets less interesting is because you start to know and predict the song. You start to predict exactly what the sound's gonna be. And maybe you're only listening for a certain part of the song, and that's still good to you. But eventually you're like, I still like the song, I'm just sick of it right now. And so then you push it away and you skip that track because you don't want to listen to it because you've listened to it so much. Why does it become boring? It's because you've fully compressed it. You remember it so well. It's no longer an interesting sense. And then I think, in a way, then finding a song disgusting and boring and you're like, oh, I can't listen to that anymore, is the highest compliment you can give a song, because you fully integrated that song so deeply in your mind that it's like a prototype to you. You've made that like the basic song that's going to change your compressibility algorithm for future music. So that's why, again, people will find different things interesting because they're at different stages of their experience and they've experienced different things. So section 2.15, how artists and scientists are alike. So this is a big quote. From our perspective, scientists are very much like artists. They actively select experiments in search for simple but new laws compressing the resulting observation history. In particular, the creativity of painters, dancers, musicians, pure mathematicians, physicists can be viewed as a mere byproduct of our curiosity framework based on the compression progress drive. All of them try to create new but non-random, non-arbitrary data with surprising, previously unknown regularities. For example, many physicists invent experiments to create data governed by previously unknown laws, allowing to further compress the data. On the other hand, many artists combine well-known objects in a subjectively novel way, such that the observer's subjective description of the result is shorter than the sum of the lengths of the descriptions of the parts, due to some previously unnoticed regularities shared by the parts. What is the main difference between science and art? The essence of science is to formally nail down the nature of compression progress achieved through the discovery of a new regularity. For example, the law of gravity can be described by just a few symbols. In the fine arts, however, compression progress achieved by observing an artwork, combining previously disconnected things in a new way, so art as an eye-opener, may be subconscious and not at all formally describable by the observer, who may feel the progress in terms of intrinsic reward without being able to say exactly which of his memories became more subjectively compressible in the process. The framework in the appendix is sufficiently formal to allow for implementation of our principle on computers. The resulting artificial observers will vary in terms of the computational power of their history compressors and learning algorithms. This will influence what is good art or science to them, and what they might find interesting. So, again, it's fascinating here. One, he's saying that we should, what artists and scientists do, we should be able to also get in computer form if we actually instantiate these algorithms. But that's also still fascinating, right? Science and art are related in a certain way. and they're both about compression. But in the case of the scientists, they're trying to find a new regularity which will enhance their compression. Essentially, it's like, there's a new unexplained phenomena, and how do we explain this within our framework? Or there's like, this is an experiment that's never been done before, and if it is done, why is it important? Well, it's important because of all these other observations and things. So it's enhancing the field, and in a way making it more compressed, making it more explainable and predictable. But in art too, it's interesting because for the artist, they have a mental image and they are creating art that is in a way intrinsically rewarding for them as themselves. But for the observer, it's a totally different reward. Because I guess, this is a hypothesis, but the observers of art will in some way be relating to the art that they observe, and it will be meaningful to them, but it's at a subconscious level that they aren't able to express why it's compressing things for them, why it makes sense to them. But again, it's like also explaining why art is subjective in many ways. Because not everyone has the same experiences and they have different compressors. And again, when you get used to an artwork, it's no longer moving to you because it's compressed what it can for you. Section 2.16 is jokes and other sources of fun. So this quote, just like other entertainers and artists, comedians also tend to combine well-known concepts in a novel way, such that the observer's subjective description of the result is shorter than the sum of the lengths of the description of the parts, due to some previously unnoticed regularity shared by the parts. So I think it's this is interesting too. Again, comedians and jokes, it's like the punchline of the joke. In a way, it's this like wellspring of, you make connections in a joke that between concepts that occur so fast, it's almost like it's exploding. And it's also why is it that when you explain a joke, it's not funny anymore? Isn't that weird? You explain a joke and it's not funny, but that's because you're unpacking the joke. It's no longer about the quick punchline, which connects things very quickly. Now it's the full-on, uncompressed version and explanation of the joke. And it takes all the fun out of it. But that's why it's like novel new ways. In a way, you have more regularity in a joke because you're relating more things to your experience. And that's why it's like, again, you can tell a joke to a room full of accountants and it's an accounting-based joke, but it's because they have so much experience of that, right? And now that joke actually lands for them because they've compressed so much of accounting experience. But when you tell that joke to a general audience, no one laughs. It's not funny because they don't have that experience to compress. They don't have those concepts to bring together in a novel way. So a weird amount of comedy can be explained, and I almost want to go into comedy in another way, in a deeper level, but you can read that section because there's almost like a theory of comedy and jokes and humor that you could make from this compression drive and explain why things are funny. But it's almost kind of scary because okay, if you fully understand humor, will nothing be funny to you anymore? Interesting to think about. All right, we're almost through this paper, but section 3.3 is reward for relative entropy between an agent's prior and posterior. So our intrinsic reward can be related to Bayesian inference in the difference between prior and posterior odds. So there's also a relation to entropy but Bayesian inference and how this can be used to compress. But section 5 here is now the conclusion and outlook of the paper. So quote here, we pointed out that a surprisingly simple algorithmic principle based on the notions of data compression and data compression progress informally explains fundamental aspects of attention, novelty, surprise, interestingness, curiosity, creativity, subjective beauty, jokes, and science and art in general. The crucial ingredients of the corresponding formal framework are 1. A continually improving predictor or compressor of the continually growing data history, a computable measure of the compressor's progress to calculate intrinsic rewards, and 3. a reward optimizer or reinforcement learner translating rewards into actions, sequences expected to maximize future reward. So that's part of this conclusion here. With this framework, many difficult questions can now be answered. Notice that the framework itself contributes to the compression of our history of experience with intelligent agents. We can understand and predict the actions of intelligent agents within the context of the framework. So, why are some experiences beautiful to some and not to others? Because each individual has their own unique experiences, which determines their ability to compress new experiences. Is beauty subjective or objective? It's both. Aspects of beauty will be objective, such as geometric regularities, which reduce the size of the compressed experience, therefore creating a strong sense of beauty. However, each person has a unique perspective due to their experience and compression ability. And yeah, like I was saying, why are jokes funny to some people and not others? Jokes combine elements into a previously unrecognized regularity in a connection we haven't experienced before. There are jokes specific to a field or time, which are unfunny to those not steeped in similar experiences. The reason is clear. Jokes appear unfunny when there is no connection to be made in the history of the observer, or the connection is already obvious or known. This also explains why old jokes aren't funny once learned. So much of a joke depends on the punchline. The punchline, the conclusion of the joke, is often a shorter description than the entire joke. Explaining a joke almost always takes away the humor. We see that a joke is unfunny when explained because the punchline is now the opposite. It's a much longer description of why it's funny, and the opposite of compressed. So, the reach of this explanatory framework is far and wide, with a nearly unending list of examples. Let us return to the meaning of life and apply the framework. So, the sense of the meaning of life is dependent on the compression of our history. We look for a unifying explanation for our past experiences and direction of our future. So we're trying to look back and explain things. We're trying to look forward and make a good prediction of an action sequence. And when our past feels random, we are unable to compress the experience in a connected way, leading us to a feeling of absurdity in our existence. There appears to be no coherent direction. At this stage, we use words like absurd and random to describe those aspects of our lives which cannot be compressed further. Notice how the framework explains why we lose interest and attention in the question of meaning and often give up the search. The unifying answer appears unobtainable given the time and information we have. Our attention is drawn to immediate or answerable concerns. Recognize a subjective sense of meaning in life at this time can only come from within. Only you have access to your history of your experience. Only you can compress your life in a subjectively meaningful way. Others can give you ideas and direction, but you must do the information processing yourself. The deeper answer to your life can be explained to you by someone else, but that is them observing the information they experience of you and what you are able to express to them. Then they simply apply their internal compressor to condense the history of your experience. Even if their compressed version is meaningful to you, you must do the work of unifying your past experiences in your mind. So, the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Existence precedes essence." Many have lived and died believing the opposite. Essence precedes existence. Essence is purpose and what we were made to do, meant to do. But we were not meant or designed for any purpose. Our essence is the unifying direction of our choices. We evolved under the constraints of natural selection with all kinds of drives and urges and desires, which led to exactly the state of the world at every moment. And we exist before we have a true essence. Our essence is given to ourselves from the compression of our personal history. We all shape our past, present, and future. And this leads to an important conclusion for subjective meaning. If an intelligent agent wants meaning, they will have to reflect on their history to identify meaningful experiences. If an intelligent agent wants more meaningful direction and control of their future, they must work to adapt their internal representations of the world to direct their actions towards meaning, a cause and effect relationship of their past experiences cohering with expected futures. So this is really about the story about which you tell of your life. Can you explain the story that led you up to this moment? And can you use that story with yourself as a character to predict your actions in the future in a meaningful way? But notice that we can give multiple descriptions of the same data. From many equal interpretations, we choose one. Our choices can change and evolve over time, but how do we choose an interpretation? How should we? If we want a meaningful life, we should choose a description of our history which opens opportunity for further growth and compression. While we have talked much about meaning in terms of cause and effect, there are other types of meaning, interdependence. So I highly recommend the great courses, The Meaning of Life, Perspectives from the World's Greatest Intellectual Traditions. This is by Professor J.L. Garfield, and particularly his lecture on the Buddha. He's like a Buddhist scholar, excellent. But the below is a reference from his lecture 34 on His Holiness the Dalai Lama the 14th. And the Buddhist tradition is definitely interesting in how they think about interdependence. So they have three types of interdependence. And there's causal factors. So one is causal factors, so I think this is objective meaning, the meaning of cause and effect. And we can have a mapping of one cause to one effect, or multiple causes to one effect, or one to multiple, or multiple to multiple. But again, this interdependence is between cause and effect. Then there's also a second type, which is part-whole interdependence. This is the interdependence of structures. We experience part-whole interdependence as self-organized dissipative structures. Each part of you is a cell, but a person is not a cell. A person is the whole of one body. We have an influence on each cell, and each cell has an influence on us. Much of this interdependence is a function of how our bodies are organized. The influence is about energy flow. How you breathe changes the function of your cells. Top-down control is the whole influencing the parts. Bottom-up control is the parts influencing the whole. You can hold your breath, top-down, but your cells will send hunger for air, bottom-up. So we are not just one person, we are part of a lower and higher levels of systems. And in ecosystems, as the complexity increases, the parts become more dependent on the whole. So a lot of part-whole interdependence. We can think of things in terms of parts and wholes, and all those wholes could be parts of something else. But the third one is really interesting too. It's called conceptual imputation. So imputation is filling in missing data. We smooth over reality to make our processing more comfortable. Imputation works because our outcomes are still accurate or effective. Concepts are ideas. Conceptual imputation is when we have learned an idea which covers the gaps of reality, raw data. So conceptual imputation is interesting in relating it to what we just talked about with the compression drive. So what are concepts? Concepts are ideas, and ideas are symbols that we use to compress our information, our history. And what's imputation? Well, sometimes there's ideas, maybe conjectures, whatever, that allow us, if we have them, even if they're not real, they allow us to compress faster. And that's what we're doing with the compression drive. That's why we would want to have imputation, because it makes things compress a bit faster and it tends to be more efficient. But it's interesting to think about, and I mean, if you want to see reality, if you want to see objective reality, these are some of the things you'd have to look out for, which is ideas which cover the gaps of reality, of raw data. But yeah, I just had this weird idea, which is like, okay, you trim your nails, right? You clip your nails, you cut them. Have you ever actually cut your nails the same way twice? Like, no, not really. You probably never ever cut your nails the same way twice. But if I say like, oh yeah, I clipped my nails this morning, then I'm doing conceptual imputation in a way, because I'm talking about an action sequence I did, and I'm saying it's the same thing that I've done before. But really, it's never been that way before. And actually, it's a unique experience which is not really truly compressible if you really get down to the details of it. But we just smooth over that. And we say, oh, this is a concept. It's the same thing I've always did. But that's not true. And it'll be a mind blower, and I'm sure it takes maybe 20 or 40 years of meditation to get past and underneath this conceptual imputation. So thank you for joining me on this journey, and gosh, we're gonna get deeper into this stuff, but please go ahead and comment if you have any questions about the compression drive, and it's just fun and interesting. Feel free to definitely read the paper on your own, and if there's anything you'd like to see this applied to. But thanks, until next time.